Great, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining this morning. As Cersei said, my name is Amanda Guthrie, and I am a fourth year PhD student at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. And today I'm here to talk to you about how people's perceptions and drivers influence how they modify their shoreline for erosion control. So starting off with the 6-word story, I made more of my question into my story of shorelines eroding, must strengthen, but how? And so this is going to the story of how these people are making these decisions and what they're doing with and how their decisions are going to be impacting the bay. So with this, I am using living shorelines as the spectrum of nature-based features that are used for erosion control. And so in the context of in low wave energy environments, we have the plantain marsh in the oyster sill and the rock silt, which are in your more moderate wave energy environments, and then your breakwater system, which is going to be your high energy environments. And all of these use some natural elements, and some of them, the latter three, do use a mixture of gray elements as well. And gray in these contexts being the oyster sills or the rocks. So we can see here in this graph that living shoreline implementation is increasing in recent years. So living shorelines are the green bars on top, but the dark gray is your bulkhead and the light gray is your riprap. The overall implementation of living shorelines is less than both bulkheads and riprap. And so we're trying to figure out why there is this lack of implementation of living shorelines. So with this, most of the research focuses on understanding the decision process relative to shoreline armoring. This is more common and therefore more applicable across regions. So we take a trip to Alabama. A survey there from Cyphers et al. Found that property owners think that bulkheads are effective and durable, but they also believe that natural shorelines are more aesthetically pleasing. And so with this, it shows when they install a bulkhead, they're more interested in the effectiveness, the perceived effectiveness of it rather than the natural aesthetics. So Sarah Stafford and Sarah Stafford is one of my co-authors as well, found that people are more likely to armor their shorelines if their property is more valuable and if they're in a region that has lower elevation and higher erosion rates. Across various studies from Oregon and Alabama and across the Mid-Atlantic, we find that neighborhood properties are key predictors of how people decide to, or how people modify their shoreline. And so what a neighbor does will often predict what the property owner will do. So with this, the objective of my work is to evaluate property owners' motivations when deciding if and how to alter their shoreline. So to do this, we have 2 surveys. So I'm going to briefly talk about the 2018 survey and dive in more into the 2020 survey, which we just completed. So in the 2018 survey, we focused on 3 localities highlighted in blue. So that's going to be the city of Norfolk, Gloucester County, and Lancaster County. And for each of these counties, we stratified the recipients, the survey recipients by fetch, marsh connectivity, and shoreline type. And so with this survey, we were able to email out or mail out to people who had unmodified shorelines as well, to understand how people had unmodified the decisions of those that had unmodified shorelines compared to those that had modified shorelines. We had a fairly good response rate here of 24%, which equates to over 700 surveys for the 3,000 surveys that we sent out. So with this, we explicitly asked them, for those that had modified their shoreline, what factors did they consider when they were deciding how to modify the shoreline. So with this, I'm going to focus on 4 of these, as there's a lot to unpack here. So we have our living shorelines in green, our breakwaters in a light blue, the bulkheads in darker blue, and riprap in the darkest blue. So across these different modification types, everyone was interested in having an effective modification. This makes sense. This is why they're installing a shoreline modification. Then we also one of the options for them to select was the desire to restore their shoreline. And so those that installed living shorelines, in this context, this is the marsh-based living shorelines, they're more interested in restoring the shoreline than those that installed breakwaters, bulkheads, or riprap. Similar is true for aesthetics. Those that installed living shorelines are more interested in the aesthetics of their shoreline than those that installed the other modification options. And then lastly, somewhat surprisingly, in contrast to most of the other literature published on this, the shoreline property owners were not interested in matching their neighbors. So this was not a direct desire to match their neighbors. So when the surveys and when studies are finding that people are matching their neighbors, this might be a factor of the contractor working in a region and inherently standardizing that shoreline, or the information and social norms within that region, but rather than not an intentional desire to match their shoreline. So with this, one of the questions we also asked was what type of proposals that they received, and living shoreline is in this light green. And so we can see that those that installed living shorelines received more living shoreline proposals than those that installed armoring. And so there's a push-pull here. So this is one of the questions that we're aiming to get out of the next survey. Don't have an answer yet today, but looking at of what's driving this. Are the contractors telling people that they need to install armoring, or are those that are installing living shorelines asking their contractors? And so trying to figure out what's driving this disparity in information flow. So two of the key findings of this extensive survey that I highlighted today was that living shoreline property owners are more interested in restoring the shoreline and the aesthetics of their shoreline. And people are not intentionally matching their neighbors, which is in contrast to much of the other literature, which is indicating that there is this other driver rather than social pressure, rather than intentional social pressure. And so this could be due to the contractors or the implicit social norms within the community. As we stratified by fetch, that we should have also accounted for the ecological setting. That should have minimized that as a factor. So now jumping into the 2020 survey. So we mailed this to anyone that had a shoreline erosion modification permit in 2019. And so this is going to be Virginia-wide. So that's going to be the gray localities on the map here, the gray and the blue. So that was over 500, and we had a fantastic response rate of over 40%. So we had around 230 recipients complete the survey and mail it back, which is absolutely phenomenal. So with this, we also asked them what factors they explicitly considered. So I am still working on breaking this out to the different modification types, but overall, fairly consistent with the previous survey. People were concerned about the effectiveness. People also were interested in having their modification withstand storms, as well as concerned of the cost. So not only the cost of the modification, but also the cost of their property home. And this relates to our previous survey because we said that those that had more expensive homes were more likely to armor. And then actually fairly rarely considered within this context is the people rarely considered the visual aesthetics, the habitat, as well as the water quality. And so these are sort of many of the secondary benefits of the greener erosion control structures that they were less considered across all recipients, across all respondents. So with this, I asked how each recipient had the perception of the varying modifications. And so what this graph is going to show is how someone believes riprap supports these varying ecosystem services on the bottom here. So the ecosystem services we asked their perception of was the aesthetics, effectiveness, sea level rise adaptation, species support, ability to withstand storms, and support of water quality. And so this figure here only is their perception of these various ecosystem services relative to riprap. So 1 on the left-hand side is going to be the very ineffective, and 5 on the top left is going to be very effective, with neutral or no effect indicated by this red bar here. And so let's walk through this. So we have those that installed bulkheads. So this is those that installed bulkheads, but this is their perception of riprap. So people that installed bulkheads thought that riprap had a neutral to somewhat effective. People who installed riprap had a view of riprap also being a little bit more effective, but nonetheless between neutral and effective. And then people that installed living shorelines viewed riprap to be a little bit less effective, but still above the no effect level. And so now we can see here that bulkheads and riprap overall did have a similar belief that riprap was a generally beautiful or generally aesthetically pleasing modification. So now going through all of them. So I'm going to highlight a few things here. So if we look at sea level rise adaptation, so this dark gray bar here is those that installed riprap believe that riprap is effective at adapting to sea level rise. Whereas those that installed bulkheads and those that installed living shorelines do not perceive riprap to be as effective. And then lastly, one of the other points here is that water quality, both people that installed bulkheads and people that installed riprap, both believe riprap to have a generally more effective effect on water quality than the beliefs of those people that installed living shorelines. Two other points here is that across all modifications, people generally felt that riprap was fairly effective at controlling erosion. And then also people believe that riprap, across all modification types, people believe that riprap was fairly effective at withstanding storms. So now this is people perceptions of bulkheads. Same colors, same schemes, and I'm going to still walk you through this one. So people that installed bulkheads definitely think that their bulkheads is aesthetically pleasing, whereas people that installed riprap or living shorelines were less likely to rate bulkheads as aesthetically pleasing. So we also see that people that installed bulkheads are more likely to rate it as higher effective at erosion control. People that installed bulkheads and riprap similarly thought bulkheads were able to adapt to sea level rise. And people that installed bulkheads were more likely to rate bulkheads as effective against withstanding storms. What's interesting here is that across all modification types, if you installed bulkhead, riprap, or living shorelines, people recognize that bulkheads did not provide species support and not provide enhanced water quality. Now getting to living shorelines. So the people that installed living shorelines, which is indicated by these green bars here, often felt that living shorelines was more aesthetically pleasing, was more effective at water quality, or more effective at erosion control, more effective in sea level rise adaptation, and more able to withstand storms than those within the bulkhead and riprap groups. Another interesting point here is that across all different modification types, even if someone installed a bulkhead, riprap, or living shoreline, these people recognized or perceived living shorelines to support species and also to improve water quality within the region. So with this, what does this come down to is that most people are focusing on shoreline modifications that relates to their effectiveness and the ability to withstand storms, which relates to what is happening to their shoreline through shoreline damage and erosion control. So people often view their modification decisions as the best for both effectiveness and withstanding storm damage. And riprap overall has been seen as able to withstand sea level rise and storm damage based off of across all modification groups. So with this, the secondary benefits, which is seen as the species support and water quality, people often recognize bulkheads are not supporting these and living shorelines are supporting these. So this shows there's this disconnect of people are knowing that their modification might not be supporting these, yet they're defaulting to their desire to have an effective modification. So with that, my next steps are I'm going to tease out this survey a little bit more and understand how these drivers are influencing their decisions and related to their experiences with the bays versus their recreation, as well as how they're getting their information source influences their perception. So with that, thank you. And I realize I am close to my time, so please reach out and email me at agguthrie@vims.edu. Thank you.